Welcome back to FRC Media. Keith Tebow with you today. As you know, we've been speaking to the candidates running in the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts, heading up to the September 1st primary. And there are 9 Democrats and 2 Republicans. We're going to be speaking now with another one of those Democrats. Joining us today, Dave Cavell. Dave, welcome. How are you?
Keith, it is great to see you again. We were together on Martin Luther King Day at BCC, and that feels like a long time ago. But it is true that it was not that long ago, and it's wonderful to see that you're still safe and healthy during this pandemic.
Well, I appreciate it, and thank you again to talking to us and to the voters of Fall River as we head to the primary. For those people who may not know you, Dave, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to run for Congress.
Sure. So I was born right here in the 4th Congressional District, born and raised, met my wife at Tufts. And then my first job out of college was as a public school teacher. I taught 4th grade in the South Bronx in New York. And I had 32 students who were incredible and incredibly bright and curious, except they had failed by the system. I had a student that would sleep through class most days. And finally, I figured out why when he let me walk him home after a couple of weeks of this. And it was because he was homeless. And he and his father were sleeping outside under a bridge at night. I had students that didn't have enough food to eat. Half of my students had asthma because of the environmental pollution. And I thought that was wrong, that in the wealthiest country in the world, we could do better. And so I went into public service. So I went and worked for Governor Deval Patrick in the State House for 3 years. I went to law school and had this incredible opportunity to work for President Obama in the White House as a speechwriter. And then 2 weeks after I left the White House, I was helping sue the White House. I was working as Maura Healey's assistant attorney general and senior advisor. And, you know, when I decided to run for this race, it was for a few reasons. The first of which is I think we need to restore integrity and professionalism and experience to the federal government. And the last 3 months here, Keith, I think have only underscored how important that is. You know, it isn't so much that, of course, the world has changed and shifted under our feet because of this global pandemic, and unemployment headed toward 25% in Fall River, 20% elsewhere. But the fact of the urgency of these issues has not changed. And it's why I got into this race. There are going to be plenty of people who want to have this job, of course. And the job will be new for all of us. None of us have served as a member of Congress before. But I think what we really need is somebody for whom this work is not new. Somebody who doesn't just sort of want to have this job, but somebody who wants to do this job. And that starts on the South Coast. You know, the future of Massachusetts starts right here. And I hope we can talk about that today because, let's just take one example. Mine is the only website in this race that is not just in English, but has been fully translated by a human being into Spanish and into Portuguese. Because in my view, if you want to represent the South Coast and you want to represent everyone on it, you've got to recognize that 20% of students in Fall River speak either Spanish or Portuguese at home. If you're not even talking to folks, how can you hope to represent them? So I hope we can talk more about this today.
Yeah, we will. But let me just ask you, and we're going to talk about a number of the issues that are in the campaign in the short time that we have together today. But is there one overriding issue that you're extremely passionate about that you hope to work on intensely in Washington?
Well, the list goes on. But I'll just start with the first one, and that's the opioid crisis. So I know that a lot of people in Fall River are skeptical of anybody who comes down to the South Coast for the first time when they're running for office and says, vote for me. And I'm not coming down to the South Coast for the first time because I'm running for office. I was down on the South Coast a lot when I worked for Maura Healey, including to work on the opioid crisis. We were suing a company called Purdue Pharma, which was run by a family called the Sackler family, and they made a drug called OxyContin. And I had worked with a lot of folks like my friend Joanne Peterson, who learned to cope in Taunton, parents who had buried children, grandparents who are raising grandchildren, people who have been devastated by the opioid crisis. We lose 5 people a day, every single day, today, yesterday, tomorrow, to an opioid overdose. And so when I decided to run for Congress, I promised those families that I would get to work on this as soon as I got to Congress, that I'd get them the aid and the resources that they need, but also get prevention education into our schools. 90% of people who struggle with substance use start using before the age of 18. And when I talk to folks on the South Coast and folks in Fall River, they tell me that they don't want to see more treatment centers open. They don't want to see, more people struggling with substance use. They want to create good long-term jobs. And that's got to be our focus as well. So while we're working on that, let's invest in making the South Coast the national leader in clean energy, the national leader in the clean energy economy. Fall River is the second deepest water port in New England. So to my mind, we got to finish South Coast Rail. We got to invest in the South Coast. We got to make, public colleges and universities tuition free and create pathways to the jobs of the future. So I see these as all of the kinds of things that I need to get to work on urgently on my first day in Congress.
We're still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you feel the national government could have done things differently? And if you're elected to Congress, how do you ensure that some of the accusations of mismanagement nationally don't happen again?
Yeah, so this, I think, is where it's really important to have people who don't just want to have this job, but want to do this job, who know this work because they've done it. So when I was in the Obama White House, I worked with a pandemic response team. And these were folks who at the time were worried about the Zika virus and responding to public health crises that President Trump decided not to retain, to let go. And so the federal response was a failure from the start. Because their experts were not listened to, science was not followed, and there were a lot of measures that should have been taken months before this pandemic hit to produce protective equipment, to increase our ability to test and do widespread testing, and to prevent what we are in right now, which is a crisis, the end of which is not clear. And I think that the impact on our businesses and on our families and on our communities has been devastating, in part as a result. So our response needs to be led by science, by facts, and by expertise. And so, yeah, look, I think the federal response to give people a single $1,200 payment, that's nice. And the Paycheck Protection Act has been, somewhat helpful for some businesses, but we've got to do far more. I mean, for families in Fall River, a single $1,200 payment when unemployment's at 25%, that's not going to cut it. And small businesses are telling me that, I was just in New Boston Bakery right before this pandemic started. For owners like Jim at New Boston, or other folks like Michael at the Portugalia Marketplace, or anywhere else, I mean, how are they going to pay their rent? How are they going to pay their vendors for food and for everything else that they need beyond just their paycheck? So, we need to really focus on what's going to help people moving forward, and we need to get people with experience back into this work. And Keith, I think that's where this response has to start and has to come from.
Throughout the pandemic, over the past 2 months, at least, there have been, concerns over racial strife in our country. The death of George Floyd has sort of brought back all those images of racism here across our country. What are your thoughts on police reform? And are you in favor of, with the air quotes, defunding police? Yeah,
well, let me start by saying, we are all, I think, called to account for in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many other Black lives in this country. We're called to account for 400 years of systemic oppression and marginalization from a country that did not act like Black Lives Mattered. And they do. And so what are we going to do about that? Well, to your point, when it comes to defunding, I think let's talk about what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about is reimagining a policing system in the United States. And that means everything from what I've called for, which is banning police chokeholds, ending qualified immunity, layering in independent oversight and accountability, ending militarization, all that. This is part of the work that I think we have to do to end police violence. But also, when I talk about reimagining and sort of asking this question here, what are we asking our police officers to do? I mean, I worked on the opioid crisis, as I mentioned, on the South Coast. And when I would talk to police departments and fire departments all the time, I would be told 911 has turned into an opioid overdose hotline. And, we were trained how to use our service weapons. We were trained how to do, the nuts and bolts of our job. We were never trained to be social workers. We were never trained to help people who have an opioid problem get into treatment and long-term recovery. I mean, that's not their job. And so I think it does make sense for us to ask ourselves, what are we doing? What are we asking those folks in law enforcement to do? And what should be better done by a social worker or by someone else? When you say defunding, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, there has been attempts to defund lots of things. In my view, some members of the Republican Party have been trying to defund schools and trying to defund social services and investments in the social safety net for a long time. And I think that's wrong. So, what we've really called for, and what I've called for, is reimagining a country that is free of systemic racism. And the last point that I want to make here, Keith, is something that we're calling the George Floyd Education Act. What that would do is bring a whole bunch of folks together, and I would introduce this in Congress, to come together and to think about how do we teach our history in this country, our real history in this country. It should not be that you can graduate from high school in this country without learning what Juneteenth is, or why holding a rally on June 19th in Tulsa, Oklahoma might not be appropriate. So it's got to start from 400 years ago all the way up through the present, and get into every classroom a real history of this country that teaches about Black history and Black lives.
I want to delve a little bit into healthcare now. What are your thoughts in terms of improving access to healthcare and healthcare insurance for all? Are you in favor of, Medicare for all or a public option? What are your thoughts?
So I am, and here's why. This is a painful and personal issue for a lot of people I know, because I've talked to folks. I talked to a woman in Milford who had insurance and got a cancer diagnosis, ended up going bankrupt, having to sell her home and move in with one of her children. And that's wrong. I mean, medical costs and unexpected bills are still one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in this country. And we have to do something about it. So yes, this is why I support a system that is true healthcare for all. And look at what has happened. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs. Thousands of folks in the 4th Congressional District and on the South Coast have lost their jobs. That's the case in lots of countries in the world. What's different about our country is that those folks have also lost their healthcare. And this is the problem with a system that is based entirely in employment. Is that, you are really making it harder to move from what we have now, in my view, which is a sick care system, to a true healthcare system with mental health parity and behavioral health and all of the supports that folks really need to have quality care that they can afford. So I think the question is how we move there. And I'm the person in this race that's actually been at the center of these fights. In the governor's office and in the state house, when we were the first state with universal health coverage, in the White House with President Obama, when we were expanding the Affordable Care Act to 26 million Americans. If we're trying to be serious about fighting for healthcare and fighting for people in this community, then I think I'm the one that has the experience to do it in Congress.
The candidates that I've spoken to thus far, a lot of you talk about opportunity for those who may not have access to those opportunities. And a lot of that goes around education. What are your thoughts on expanding or improving upon both K through 12 and also public higher education?
Yes. So I'm glad you brought this up. As I said, I'm the only former public school teacher in this race, and education is deeply important to me. And so that's why we released the most comprehensive plan in this race on education. And it's called the Horace Mann Plan for Education, a proud son of the 4th Congressional District from Franklin. And, this plan calls for a bunch of things. It starts with really stepping up our efforts during COVID. Because there are so many, particularly as you say, families who can least afford it, who have been hardest hit by the disruptions in school. And that means low-income families, it means immigrant families, and so many others. Kids without access to devices so that they can learn remotely. We need to make sure that we get that assistance to them. We also need to make sure that schools and teachers have the protective equipment that they need to reopen safely and the testing. I think we need to do at least twice as much. And I've been talking to some business leaders in the Fall River area who agree. And then, longer term in education, I think we need to really ask ourselves, are we doing everything we can to invest in our future? And if we're not, why not? There's no better investment than we can make, in my view, than in our schools and in our students and in our teachers. And so that's got to start with universal pre-K. That's got to mean reinvesting in K-12 education and de-emphasizing charter schools. That's got to mean tuition-free public colleges and universities, and creating real pathways and pipelines to the jobs of the 21st century and the careers of the 21st century on the South Coast.
Yeah. Prior to COVID-19, the economy seemed to be moving right along. Unemployment was low. Many people were working. However, the income gap between those, at the top
Yep.
and those at the bottom, that gap seemed to have been growing. How do you handle coming up with ideas on how to, shrink that gap between the haves and the have-nots, if you will?
Yeah. Well, this is why I got into public service, because that level of income inequality is unacceptable. And this system that you talk about, Keith, it works really well for the richest people in America, for the wealthiest companies in America, and it doesn't work for anybody else. So, look, I think it is 100% legitimate for us to ask the wealthiest Americans to pay a little bit more for the social services, the education, and all the other things that we need. So that means I think the estate tax doesn't kick in right now until you have a $22 million estate, which, good for you, but come on. It used to be $7 million when President Bush left office. I think we can go back to that. If you have a $7 million estate, you're still doing pretty well. This would only impact about 14,000 families in this country, but it would help pay for so many of the things that we need to do. And then to the main point of your question, how do we really address income inequality in America? I think we need to recognize that these issues are interrelated or intersectional, if you will. That, we don't just have an affordable housing crisis in a lot of places in the 4th District. We also have a transportation crisis, right? We haven't completed South Coast Rail. We've been talking about that since the 80s. What are we doing if we're not actually investing in our future? At the same time that we've got a crisis in terms of school funding formulas. We've got a crisis in terms of jobs and economic development in the clean energy economy. We need to recognize that the solving these challenges means solving them together. Ending redlining and housing discrimination, predominantly against immigrant communities and people of color. That's part of solving our transportation and our affordable housing crises in this state. All of this is related. When we attack student debt, that is another way of leveling the playing field and making sure that everyone in this country has an opportunity, there's that word again, to get ahead. And I think we should send somebody to Congress who's actually been in these fights and actually done this work.
Are you in favor of the Green New Deal? And if so, or if not, how do you feel we should deal with the climate change issue?
Yes, I am. So the Green New Deal is one of the first things I hope to vote for as a member of Congress. And I think it is a perfect illustration of the point that we were just talking about before. These issues are interrelated. So if you say, do we have to tackle the climate crisis? The answer, of course, is yes. But somebody asked me the other day, can we still focus on the climate crisis when we're dealing with the COVID pandemic and unemployment? My answer is yes, because we have to deal with them together. I actually released my COVID response plan the same day as my climate crisis plan because they're related. When we're facing 25% unemployment, let's invest in a future that saves the planet and prevents the South Coast from flooding because of the climate crisis, but also invests in the jobs of the future. And one of my favorite statistics is that there's only 50,000 coal jobs left in the whole country, total 50,000. There's 110,000 clean energy jobs in Massachusetts alone today. So that's why I think Fall River should be the leader in Atlantic offshore wind. It's why I think Brayton Point and Somerset should be the leader in the clean energy economy. It's why we need to finish South Coast Rail. It's why we need to invest in affordable housing. It's why we need to invest in mass transit, right? These are all of the ways to get people into the careers and the jobs of the future, to build it on the South Coast, and to have a future where, yes, we can breathe the air, and yes, we can drink the water, and yes, the oceans don't flood Fall River, but also where folks in Fall River and in Somerset and in Attleboro can get into these careers and these jobs right here at home.
All the issues we've talked about thus far, those domestic issues appear to be, very important and normally drive people to the polls on election day. But as a member of Congress, you're also going to need to be voting on some foreign policy issues. Yeah. How do you see our foreign policy and how you can make a difference in making some changes? Yeah.
So let me start by telling you what I believe, or more accurately, what I don't believe in, which is the Trump administration's foreign policy. And it's not so much that I disagree with it. It's that I'm not sure that they have one. And I say that because I feel like whatever the president decides to tweet every morning, to the surprise, frankly, of folks in the Pentagon, former secretaries of defense who have disavowed the administration's foreign policy, and our allies around the world, I mean, that's no foreign policy at all. And I actually am the only person in this race that's actually dealt with foreign policy, development, seen it up close. And I was in the Obama White House, and I'm thrilled to be supported by Ben Rhodes and other folks in that work and in the national security area who, know that we need to bring seriousness and expertise back to this work. And so, look, my view is the American military is the greatest fighting force the world has ever known. But we need to do right by our service members, by our military families, and by our veterans who sacrifice so much and are willing to do so. But I think we can only ask them to do that if we are doing so in a way that is intelligent and thoughtful and protects and safeguards our interests, that helps rebuilds our alliances with our allies and stands up to our adversaries, people that have tried to undermine elections here in the United States, that don't have our best interests at heart, that put bounties on service members who were serving abroad. I mean, that is unacceptable. And so I think what we need is a foreign policy that recognizes our soft power, our ability to use diplomacy, whether it's in reopening our relationship with Cuba, establishing the Iran nuclear deal to remove. I'm an American Jew, and so removing the greatest existential threat to the future of the Middle East, I think, was a critical thing for us to do. And the Trump administration abandoning it with no replacement plan in place, I think, was a grievous error in judgment. But on all of these issues, we need people who are willing to bring folks together, to sit in a room, and to really talk about what we're doing and why.
As we head to the primary and the general election, the legislature passed a bill, the governor signed, to expand voting in Massachusetts to allow more mail-in voting ballots. How do you view that as being a positive impact to the election process?
Look, I'm all for it. I've been calling for vote by mail for a long time, and definitely since March in this race, because this is critical. We cannot ask anyone, any of you watching, can't be asked to choose between your safety and your well-being and participating in democracy. So sending a ballot in the mail, you'll all be sent a ballot application, fill that out, send it in, you'll get a ballot, mail that in. Every single vote needs to be counted. Every single voice needs to be heard. We're at a real moment of crisis here. So we should make it as easy as possible for people to vote. And by the way, Keith, I don't think that just ends with voting by mail. I think we should also use this opportunity to institute ranked choice voting. I could win this primary with 20% of the vote. That's crazy. 4 out of 5 people could go to the polls and vote for somebody else, and I could still win. I think the mayoral recall election in Fall River was a perfect example of why we need ranked choice voting. Let people rank their candidates in order of preference. And so, I think we need to do that. Automatic voter registration, early voting expansion, same-day registration, and we need to end partisan gerrymandering. We need to get dark money out of politics. This is a real crisis for our democracy, and it's not a partisan issue. It doesn't matter. It's not about helping Democrats win or helping Republicans win. This is about helping our democracy, and that's what I'm in favor of.
As we head closer to election time, I'm sure with all the domestic issues, you may be hearing more about the partisanship that has been in charge in Washington, how it seems like both sides can't get together on many issues. As one of 435 congressmen, how do you hope to change that?
Yes, you're right. And I know that it frustrates a lot of folks to see that people are just bickering and not getting things done. So the first thing I want to say is, as a member of Congress, I come from the school of thought that I'm not being elected by the people necessarily who vote for me. I'm being elected to serve everyone. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican. I'm here to serve you. So that's how I approach this work, and that's how I would be a member of Congress. My college roommate already beat me to Congress. He is a conservative Republican from the state of Texas named Dan Crenshaw. And, Dan and I disagree fundamentally about a lot of issues. But Dan is not my enemy. And where we can find agreement and common ground, I'm not somebody who thinks we have to agree on everything to work together on anything. That's my job, is to find areas of agreement, to do things that are good for the 4th District, that are good for the South Coast. That's what I need to be doing. And so I think part of this, though, Keith, is that we need to talk about this work better. This is what I saw. How we talk about this work really matters. Because when you break it down, Americans just are not as divided as we're led to believe that we are. If you actually sit folks down and say, do you think that every kid should go to a good school? Everyone says yes. If you say to people, do you think that, the climate crisis is real? 75% of Americans say yes. If you say to people, do you think you should have to pass a background check to buy a gun? 91% of Americans, Keith, 91% say yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, who can actually talk about this work in that way? Who, not somebody who's just going to go there and vote the right way. Who's going to lead the right way? Who's going to talk about these issues, talk about why they matter to the 4th District, and get them done?
Yeah. As we head to the primary, I've noticed, and I think I may have even asked you this question back in January. The 9 of you who are running for the Democratic nomination reside in 3 communities: Brookline, Newton, Wellesley. Is there any fear of sort of a disconnect between people up in the northern part of the district and those in the south, including Fall River?
So you are absolutely right that folks on the South Coast are skeptical. Whenever somebody shows up, as I said, for the first time on the South Coast when they're running for office. And you should be skeptical. And I'm not. I've been on the South Coast a lot because of the work that I've done in the Attorney General's office for the South Coast. Everything from the clean energy economy and offshore Atlantic wind development to the opioid crisis. And, when I'm in office, I've also committed to not just having 2 offices, one in Attleboro and one in Newton. I mean, and not just having a couple coffees a year on the South Coast. I don't think that gets it done. We need to be talking to everyone. And so my commitment is traveling offices. We are going to rent out office space in city and town halls across the 4th District and bring the services of the office to you. It's something I saw Maura Healey do. I was working for her when we were in what we called the People's Law Firm. And I would be the people's representative. I would come to Fall River. I would rent out the office space, bring the services and the staff from the office there, and be there for you. Be there to answer questions, be there to be a resource, be there for Fall River when you need us. And I think that extends to the rest of this work. Again, my website, is the only one in this race that's fully translated, not just in English, but in Spanish and in Portuguese. You got to talk to everyone if you're really serious about representing everyone. So as a member of Congress, I assure you, the South Coast would be at the absolute forefront of everything that I would do as your representative.
All right, Dave, we're just about out of time. Final question from me. How can people find out more about your campaign?
Well, DaveCavell.com is the way to go. It's CAV as in victory, I hope, ELL.com. We also have Cavell, the number 4 Congress. That's on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter at David F. Cavell. And then we also have on DaveCavell.com the only digital door knocking site in this race. It's a way where if there's a question that Keith didn't ask me that you want to ask, go on the website, go to DaveCavell.com. Right at the top, it says Ask Dave a Question. And you can ask me anything you want. You can also see all my prior answers. So folks type in questions, I record videos and respond. And it's a way of still having a conversation, not letting a global pandemic stop us from talking about the things that matter. And I think this is important, not just for the purposes of a campaign, but we need somebody who's ready to hit the ground running as your member of Congress. And I think if you go on that website, that's what you're going to see. The most comprehensive plans in the race, the most thoughtful ways of reaching out to people in the race, and somebody who is ready to do this job for you and for the entire South Coast and the entire 4th District on day one.
Dave Cavell, Democratic candidate for the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District. Thank you for joining us and speaking to the people of Fall River. All the best. Good luck. And hopefully we'll talk again soon.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Keith. Stay safe.
All right. Thank you. And I want to thank you for watching us here on FRC Media as we continue to speak to the candidates in the race. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great rest of your day.